Well, good noon, everyone, and welcome to today's FS Club webinar on why the roots of true conservatism are essential to saving the planet. I'm dialing in from London, and we have as our special guest today the Right Honourable Lord Deben, John Gummer, dialing in from Suffolk. And it's really a delight to have John here, and I'll explain why in just a moment. Now, you'll all know me. I'm Michael Mainelli. I'm one of the directors of ZN. And it truly is my privilege to be able to introduce so many of these webinars. And I can only do so because our sponsors allow us to range widely and freely across technology, economics, and finance. And today's subject is clearly one dear to all of our hearts, which is what are we going to do about saving the planet? And John is here to present why it is that true conservatism is essential to that. Now, like many of you, I have late at night been known to say impolite things about politicians, but I did have the delight of meeting John back in the early 1990s and working with him in particular on the Marine Stewardship Council. And I must say, of all the politicians that I've known in this space, John is far and away the one that I most admire. And it's really a delight to have him here today to give us his views. Now, I won't introduce him at length because you've already seen the email, you've already signed up, and things are being posted in the website because we want to get straight to the issue at hand. So my job is very much to get out of your way and let you hear from John. Really three housekeeping points, if I may. John's recording will be up in approximately 48 hours, perhaps a little bit quicker. I would also encourage you to please send in questions, comments, observations, what have you, and I will feed those into John. My third point is please use the GoToWebinar question facility. I won't get your emails or your texts or your WhatsApps or your signals until after the meeting, which is no use. So please use the GoTo questionnaire facility. John will be receiving all of the questions. So if you've got a detailed question or something, it will be there with your email attached to it. I will make sure that John gets all of that later today. Anyway, just to kick things off, we thought it might be a little bit of fun to issue a quick poll just to get the tenor of the audience. We have another poll perhaps later on. So just to read that out, on the 27th of June, 2019, the UK became the first major economy in the world to pass laws to end its contribution to global warming by 2050. I think you're all very familiar with that. So I'll just launch the poll, which is, what do you think? The UK should have no such target. 2040 would be better. 2050 is about right, or 2060 would work fine. The audience are up to over half. It's a very swift audience here, John. So they're 3/4 of them have voted. 80% of them have voted. I'm just going to close the poll in a second, and I will share the results, which is basically half the audience like 2050 and the other half would prefer 2040, and 7% don't believe we should have such a target, but nobody would like to slide the target back in time. So that gives you, I think, a tenor of the audience there, John. And with no further ado, if I may, the floor is yours on why the roots of true conservatism are essential to saving the planet.
Well, thank you very much. As you know, Michael, and for those very kind words, but as you know, I sit as a Conservative in the House of Lords, although I vote as an independent, as the Conservative whips have discovered over the years. And I was chosen as the chairman of the Climate Change Committee by 4 ministers, because that's the way it happens. The Liberal Democrat Secretary of State for Climate Change, as it was, the Socialist First Minister of Wales, the Scottish Nationalist First Minister of Scotland, and the Protestant Unionist First Minister of the North of Ireland. And they got a Conservative and a Catholic. So they did quite well to make sure they had somebody quite different. But when I talk about true conservatism, I'm not having any reference to the present government. I think the present government isn't doing too badly on climate change, but I will not be drawn on what I think it's doing on every other issue. And of course, Brexit was a terrible mistake. But leaving that aside, we now come to what true conservatism perhaps is asking us. And it really is to concentrate on the fact that if we're going to deliver what we need to deliver, the market is absolutely essential. There is no way of doing it by direction and control by governments What governments have to do is to set the parameters within which the market operates. And the reason for that, the reason it has to do that, is because the market is a remarkably valuable way of asserting the sensible directions in which investment should take place. But it doesn't actually always have very long sight. It can be very much affected by what's happening immediately. And although what's happening immediately may be the way in which the democratic nature of the market operates, it's the sort of thing that has resulted in us destroying the future. And the best example of that perhaps is fishing. If you look at the Dogger Banks and you looked at the Grand Banks of Canada, you see that the market demanded that people should pull out as much cod as possible. The reality was they pulled out so much cod that the cod disappeared. In the case of the Grand Banks of Canada, they've never returned. Yet the market demanded that they should produce it all the time. But that is not the kind of market which I think true conservatives believe in. What they believe in is that the market is not a master, the market is not a god. What the market is a mechanism which is the most sensible mechanism to run an economy. But a market needs to be corrected, and there are many failed markets. And markets fail very often because of lack of foresight. Governments, therefore, have to have a degree of foresight. But markets also fail because of uncertainty. It's very often true that people just can't invest because the number of uncertainties are too great. Now, all of us know that there has to be risk in any kind of investment. The less risk you have, the smaller the return. But risk itself has to be reasonable, and it has to be calculable to a degree great enough to make people take that risk in competition with other risks that are around. And that's why the risk in this case has to be restrained by governments committing themselves to a program which ensures that people know the direction in which the economy is being run, know what the government's priorities are, and accept that the foresight of the government, which is so essential, is actually going to be stuck to. In other words, having decided on it, they are going to continue along that line. Nothing is worse than a government that promises that this is the route it will take and then removes that promise. Two recent examples will show what I mean. The first is the monstrous decision by this government to cut its overseas aid by 0.2 from the previous 0.7 to 0.5. Now, that is disgraceful in any case. You don't, in difficult times, take it out on poorer people than you. That's biblically wrong, leave alone any kind of personal individual. You just can't do it. But of course, it's very bad too in economic terms, because it is on that promise, that commitment, in this case, that election commitment, that people's long-term plans have been laid down. And if you remove that, first of all, it makes their plans impossible of achievement, but also they don't believe you again. You can say it's temporary, but they never believe you again because you've done it. Now, that's true, of course. And another example. In 2017, the Conservative government went back on the long-term commitment to having a compulsory net zero home, that you had to have zero carbon homes. And they went back on it, and we've built 1 million homes since then, all of which will have to be retrofitted. Although the house building industry was ready to go with it in 2017, because that is what the government had committed itself to, some 6 or 7 years ago before, giving time for the industry to get itself ready. Now what has happened, of course, is that we have allowed a totally unconservative and utterly unfair thing to happen, which is that the house building industry, facing some of the best returns on capital and best profits that they've received over many years, that housing industry has passed on the cost of producing an energy efficient home from its own shoulders to the purchaser. And the purchaser hasn't had a cheaper home as a result, because we all know that house prices are fixed not by any measure of the cost of building or the profit that is necessary to have. House prices in Britain are fixed by the house builder recognizing that if he gets planning permission on this particular piece of land, the market will bear a particular price. Therefore, he pays for the land the sum which enables him to build to that price and get the profit which he wants from that price. If you have to build more expensively, which to start with is true if you're going to build an energy efficient house, if you're going to build more expensively, then you merely pay less for the land. The competition for that land is at a lower level, because the difference between agricultural value and development value is so great that there is plenty of elasticity in that as far as the landowner is concerned. Now, I take those two examples because they both remind us that the first part, when we say that government has to have a clear view of the future in order to give to the market a long-term view, which it wouldn't otherwise have, reminds us that that clear view can't be chopped and changed all the time, and that governments have to remind themselves that not only is it true in big things like the two I have quoted, but in small things, because they should not be saying what they constantly do, which is that they are preferring the perfect to the good, because they wish to fiddle about with the way in which they have instituted subsidies, the way they've instituted regulations, the way they have instituted laws. Those are things which need to be as long-standing as possible if the market is to do its job effectively. If you are constantly changing the goalposts, the market works very badly indeed, because people have no confidence either in investment or in purchasing. So you never build the kind of supply chain, you never build the kind of modernity in investment which you need. So how should we deal with the present circumstance? Now, there were 7% of the respondents who said they would prefer not to have a target at all. Well, let me tell them that the target has made a major difference. When it was 80%, what happened was that there were quite a number of people who felt that they would be among the 20% who wouldn't have to do anything. Indeed, very many more than 20% of people thought that they would be the favoured few. The huge advantage of net zero is that everybody knows that they're all bloody well in it. There's nothing they can do about it. And therefore, because they're in it, they have got to maximise what they can do, because they know the cost of the difference, which is taken, of course, by sequestration, by actually taking carbon out of the atmosphere, which is why it's net zero and not zero. So the cost of such emissions as we have to have by the very nature of being human beings, that cost is bound to be high. So let's get rid of as much as we possibly can, says industry. But then the question is that some people thought that we ought to go for 2040 rather than 2050. Now, if I may say so, I'm sorry your question was asked in that way, because my answer to it would be, yes, of course it would be better if we went for 2040, but we can't. The reason that the Climate Change Committee suggested 2050 was that all our calculations showed that we would find it almost impossible to reach 2040, not because we would lack ambition, but simply the order in which things had to happen simply couldn't be accommodated by 2040. Now, that's why some people, some businesses can get a net zero by 2040, because they don't have to take the whole of the economy into account. What we were looking at was that there are parts of the economy which will take that time to get to where they have to be, because there are so many intermediary steps that there are. One of the best examples of that perhaps would be the heavy goods vehicle. We all know that vehicles which are lighter can go electric, and that's why the government has been so right to move from its ridiculous, under Mr. Grayling's 2040 date, gradually to 2035, 2033, and then to 2030, which is, I think, the earliest date that we can properly have a situation in which none but electric or equivalent cars can be sold. But if you take heavy goods vehicles, we think we know how we can deal with them. We think we can do it through hydrogen. The trouble is we can't produce hydrogen in an economic and green way at the moment. And we've got to get the technological breakthroughs to do that. So it's all right for the extreme campaigners to say that we're being pusillanimous and not going for something that's earlier. But it would be quite wrong to say we could, because we don't know how you do certain things, but we do know how long it will take to get an answer from a range of possibilities. Now, for me, that is a crucial issue, because the Climate Change Committee has gained worldwide reputation for the excellence of its work, based upon a decision made by my predecessor, who was an economist and who really did, I think, give us the most wonderful start. Because what he said was, let's always remember the Climate Change Committee is not a campaigner. The Climate Change Committee's job is to understand the science, work out how best to achieve the end, having decided what end the science demands of us, and then be absolutely accurate, never stepping beyond where knowledge is, without saying, we don't know here, but the best information we have would suggest this. So people always know where they are. They always know with us that. And that's why 2050 is so important, because when we say we can reach it by 2050, we mean it. We can. Everybody can be absolutely confident. Whereas if we said we hope we can meet it by 2040, they wouldn't have that confidence. And indeed, it would whittle away the strength of the date which we have. Other issue is, of course, how do we pay for it? And that's why I come back to the market, the last thing I want to say. It's the market that's going to pay for it. Almost all the cost of climate change battle is going to be paid by investment by the private sector, guided and directed certainly by sensible governments making long-term decisions. But it will be the private sector which will invest. That, of course, means that the government is under pressure to create the circumstances in which that investment will take place. because like any government, the British government will want to say, well, we are doing best perhaps from other countries in the world on climate change. We want to get some advantage from that. We want to have part of the supply chain. We want to make sure that people in this country get the new green jobs that are necessary. Now, happily, what we have to do for climate change is exactly what we have to do to get out of COVID. And this is why there has been a huge change in the way in which these things are looked at. First of all, from government. It used to be true that I could go around the country, the world, and say to people, of course, our problem is the Treasury. And I'd get knowing smiles from every kind of climate campaigner round the world. Now I have to say to you that our biggest ally is the Treasury, because the Treasury has seen that the green programme which we're putting forward is necessary to get out of COVID at the same time. Now, that doesn't mean to say the Treasury agree with everything, and it doesn't mean to say that we don't have to battle hard with the Treasury, but it does mean that the Treasury is producing, at our request and with their enthusiasm, a document showing how we will get a just transference from where we are to where we have to be. And that justice is crucially important, because the cost of this, such as will fall upon the public, has got to fall upon the public fairly. So where it is an increase in price, then that price must not be skewed towards those least able to pay it. As it is indeed at the moment, where all the cost of green electricity is placed on the electricity bill and not on the gas bill at all. So the trouble is that the 80% who have both gas and electricity find that their power costs overall are shared out. But the 20%, among whom are some of the poorest, who only have electricity, are paying the whole of the cost proportionately, and that is absolutely unacceptable. And so we need to have a just transition. But the last thing I want to say about the cost is this. The Climate Change Committee has been very accurate in the work it has done on costs. All our past history shows that we have got it right. Now, that doesn't guarantee, as they say in the investment portfolios, that doesn't guarantee we get it right in the future, but it does suggest that we can do our sums. And we have shown in very great detail that we can deliver this by less than 1% of our GNP a year. Now, that is a very small amount when put against investment in general. That is not an impossible amount to deal with. The problem is that it is not evenly spread, and we have to look about how you deal with that. Now, that may mean subsidizing people buying electric cars. It may mean helping companies with very heavy energy costs to start with, all sorts of things of that kind to get justice across the economy. But the truth is, it can be paid for. The truth is that it isn't a huge cost. And the truth is that most of the cost we have to pay, we were going to have to pay anyway to recreate and recalibrate our economy post-COVID. And perhaps I can leave you with two single thoughts. The first, COVID has had this unexpected benefit. It has given us a pause in which we can look at our economy, look at many aspects of it, and many things will change. Not because they've started now, but things that were already changing will have been speeded up by the coming of COVID. That's what pandemics have always done. They haven't changed the world. They've increased the speed with which changes which were already happening, like what we're doing today, happen more happily. All those grandparents who used to say, I have to get my grandson to deal with a television set because I can't do it. They're the very people who've learned to use all these virtual mechanisms, because otherwise they haven't been able to talk to their grandchildren. And all of us will go back to the office in different ways different times, and we'll all use this much more widely than we've ever done it before because it's taught us. And the last thing I want to leave you with is a quotation from the Pope. The Pope produced the great encyclical Laudato Si nearly 6 years ago. It was a groundbreaking document, and many scientists who are atheists will tell you, if you want to know about climate change, the best thing to read is this very short encyclical by the Pope. And His Holiness says one very important thing, which to me is the key to understanding climate change. He says, climate change is the symptom of what we have done to the world. And when you deal with a symptom, of course, you really do nothing. You have to deal with the disease. And that is really what we're doing by turning to a green economy. We're putting back the fertility in the soil, which we've taken out by industrialized farming methods. We are recreating the way of drawing carbon out of the atmosphere, which originally made the world habitable. We are dealing with the loss of biodiversity, which is part of the reason for pandemics and part of the reason why so much that we desire and need won't be possible, because we have allowed it to be so removed and destroyed. It's what we're doing about poverty, because only in that way will we create a world in which people's choices are not the choices of desperation, but the choices of a proper life, and therefore they will make choices which also control the number of people and the way in which our society can handle that number. And we're doing it too because we're removing the pollution which is shortening the lives of so many people. So the concept that this is the shocking symptom, the warning, the statement that the body which gives us life is ill and needs to be cured, it's that, together with the good news of the cost, which really ought to guide us in future.
John, thank you so much. And the board is lit up here with questions. And I'm just going to kick in with one from me first, though. Targets. Targets are very important because that's how government frames, as you said earlier, the environment in which the market and investment work. On the other hand, too many targets, and you look like the Soviet Union. And you picked this sort of intermediate target of electric vehicles, or well, non-fossil fuel vehicles by 2030. A lot of people have said that that is actually a poor target because it has obviated the ability to consider hydrogen for what you might call normal vehicles as opposed to HGVs. How do we move forward without having a proliferation of politically driven targets?
Well, I don't myself see that as a target. I think that just is simply that we have to have regulations of motor cars. This is the regulation to show what a motor car is going to be like in 2030. I mean, I really genuinely think that that's what you have to do. And I'm not a believer, of course, as a Tory, in picking winners, but you do actually, you have to recognize an old religious truth that there are many agnostics who don't actually really want to make up their mind, if you know what I mean. And I think there is a problem here about technology. If you're not careful, you're so busy keeping every opportunity open that you close nothing. And so you do have to get that balance right. And the question about hydrogen, I do think, is one that you can say there's a very clear answer. We cannot produce hydrogen at a cost either to the environment or in terms of economic cost, which makes it sensible to use it at the moment as an alternative to electricity, where we really have found a way of doing that, and we have found a way of not only of producing the electricity by renewables, but also of manufacturing the cars. And the truth is that by the time we get to 2030, it'll be much cheaper to run an electric car and to buy an electric car, and certainly to get it repaired than it will be to have a petrol or diesel driven car. So I think they are different things. I agree with you about the targets. The only other thing I think about targets is that 2050 is very good because it sets the total pattern. But on the other hand, if you only have that one, then every politician knows perfectly well they're not going to be alive probably by the time they're checked as to whether they've reached that. So I'm a great believer in the interim targets on the way to that. In other words, not a different target, but a simple step on the way. So that's why I'm very proud that the Climate Change Committee was asked and delivered a figure which the government has accepted, that we will have to reduce our emissions by 2030 by 68% on 1990. Now, 68% is a tough measure. It's pretty near towards the 80% we were going to do by 2050. It's a tough measure, but it's necessary if you're going to reach 2050 and net zero. And it's also extremely helpful for business because people know that they've got to get a significant way by then, and you can't put it off.
Got lots of questions here. Graham Elliott, if periodic data received over the coming years suggests that we are undershooting for the 2050 target, should it be rescheduled to a later year, or should 2050 be adhered to what may? And Mark Cook makes a point here, wondering, do we need to build nuclear for all of these targets to be achievable?
Well, first is no, you can't move any later because the other problem that you've got is that climate change doesn't wait. And every year that we don't do the things, the more expensive it becomes and the more difficult it becomes. And it would be just balmy. I mean, no businessman would do it on that basis. And I do think that's part of my belief in real conservatism is you've got to ask yourself what you would do if it were your own money, making your own choices and your own future. The answer is you certainly wouldn't put it off. You really wouldn't. It's like the rainwater goods. If you know that it's leaking down the walls, you do actually mend it, whether you have the money or not, as a matter of fact, because you know it's going to cost you more and maybe disastrous. As far as nuclear, yeah, I'm not an opponent to nuclear power, but I see it as a transitional scheme. The nuclear industry has been totally hopeless in ever meeting any of its targets at any time, and certainly not its price target. It seems to me that it's a necessary part of our immediate needs. So we supported the building of Hinkley. There probably is a need, well, not probably, we think there is a need for further investment in nuclear. But the thing I want people to remember is that this isn't a single choice. I mean, if you're going to build more nuclear power, I do ask the question is, should that not be tied up with justice and with the levelling up agenda? And so I have questions as to whether government should be choosing to build new nuclear power in the south and east of England rather than in the north and northwest and northeast. And it seems to me that given that the nuclear power industry needs government support in order to do it, seems to me it's in the hands of the government to decide where that should go. But I can't go further than that because as chairman of the Climate Change Committee, it is not my business to tell the government where to put these things. I just think it would link together better with the whole concept of lifting up the poorer parts of the nation.
Robert Pay, Lord Deben, you spoke eloquently of market mechanisms. What role should carbon taxes play in governing behavior rather than focusing on regulating technology and materials or subsidies to green technologies? And related to that, Maury Schenk asks, how do you draw the line between a market-based and regulatory solution? Effective market-based solutions to environmental problems, e.g. emissions trading, generally require a significant regulatory component to implement them. And related to that, back to Robert's point, is taxation, which creates markets, incentives, a market-based approach in your opinion?
Well, first of all, I think this is a fascinating series of questions because it just puts into real contrast the problem of what it might be called the true conservative, because we are faced with a whole lot of fake conservatives at the moment who are actually not conservatives at all. And I will use an example out of this country, but you will be able to read back to it. But Mr. Trump was not a conservative. Mr. Trump was an occupationist. He believed in supporting the occupiers. And the free market is not about occupation. The free market is about disruption. The free market is about creating a society in which people can use the market to change. Whereas Mr. Trump was about keeping Peabody coal in business. We're not about that if we're talking about the free market. So the first thing is you need the free market to make the pressures, the choices, the difference, the innovations. But if it's going to do that, of course, there are standards that you have to set, because otherwise it's undermined. And of course, what the occupants very often do is to create standards which they can meet and which other people can't meet. They do that. That's a very important part of it. Very often they pretend it's about security, safety, or the environment. America is one of the most protectionist nations on earth. And it protects its economy, its occupants, by a whole series of things which have nothing to do with the reality. No reason at all why foreigners couldn't buy American Airlines. The idea that this is a national security issue is false. It's just like that because they want to protect that. Why on earth can't you import sugar from Jamaica? It's because the American sugar industry is determined to stop you. Why is it that you can't move lemons into any state which is coterminous with a state which grows lemons? It's got nothing to do with phytosanitary reasons. It's to do with protectionism. And it all goes under the idea that it's somehow to do with private enterprise and free enterprise. It's not that at all. It is occupationism, and we have to fight against that. So if you're going to have a real free market, regulation is an important part of it. I mean, if you want everybody to have a motor car, you do have to make it a rule that we drive on one side of the road. It may not be what the libertarian likes, but the libertarian is wrong. You have to drive on, in this country, the left-hand side of the road. Otherwise, you do have chaos and disaster. And what's more, you have no market, because nobody's going to drive a motor car if they're going to be entirely unsafe. So this is so true about a whole range of other things. This is why I'm having major arguments with the government about agriculture. You can't say that you want to have the highest welfare standards and you want to have the highest safety standards if you're going to allow products from America and Brazil, and you take the safety standards. America has more than 4 times as much foodborne disease than we do because it has crap safety standards. And you need to say, I'm sorry, you can export here, but we're the customer and we're going to put this standard. And if that means you won't have a free trade arrangement, so be it. But you can't have a system whereby you are not prepared to regulate to the degree of protecting the safety of the public. And that, of course, means thinking about climate change. So, of course, that's when the carbon taxation comes in, because that is, whether you call it taxation or call it a trading system, I myself think it's a slightly artificial distinction. Because what you're trying to do in both cases is to make the customer pay the price that the product actually costs. I come back to true conservatism. What went wrong in the 19th century was that those liberal manufacturers managed to get people to accept that they could sell cheap goods by landing the cost on the next generation. So if you drive in from Heathrow and you look on the right-hand side, there's some great heaps. Well, they are actually the rubbish heaps from the manufacturers who were there. Now, we've put glass over it and we spend a lot of money on it. It looks rather nice at the moment. But the truth is, what they did was to sell their goods below cost and put the cost forward on the community later. And now what the tax or the market does is to make you pay now the real cost of the product instead of polluting the atmosphere and expecting the local authority to clean it up.
Well, it's interesting. Douglas Andrews makes a point here that the roots of conservatism in the U.S. have been based on fossil fuels. The earliest spokesman of conservatism, William F. Buckley, the Koch brothers, all funding major conservative think tanks, derive their wealth primarily from fossil fuels. So he's interested in breaking that umbilical. And I think you and I had this discussion as well about, is it occupancy or even the distinction between capitalism and free markets, and that the origins of conservatism are very much in that free market that we need to push.
I would be very surprised if William Buckley would today not have accepted the science of climate change, because he was a man who was really based upon taking the realities of life. And his conservatism was real conservatism in the sense that he recognized the realities of life. The problem with the Koch brothers and others is that if they recognize it, they prefer to ignore it and make their money while they can. I'm not prepared to be held to ransom by people who are making money while they can and ignoring what their children and grandchildren will have to pay for.
I completely agree with you. It's that bit about, okay, fine, but there's a cost to it, and you have to bear that cost. Yeah. And this is the bit that's missing. Richard Andrews is curious. He wonders if having a UK target transfers at least some of the problem elsewhere, for example, to highly polluting and environmentally damaging activities such as rare earth element mining in China to provide the materials for the electric car batteries. So the net global gain is severely crimped. And a couple of other people are interested in your thoughts on carbon border adjustment taxes or mechanisms that are being discussed.
Well, first of all, you do have to take the production emissions in the context of consumption emissions. That is absolutely right. We use production emissions for two reasons. One is because that is the comparative for the world as a whole. In other words, if you don't do it that way, you have double counting. Every nation does its counting on what it produces. One can see immediately what would happen if you didn't do that. But the second reason is that those are emissions over which you have complete control. Production emissions are in your country, you have control over it, and government therefore has a direct scope one responsibility for those emissions. But you have to recognize the consumption emissions as well, because there are two things you do with it. One is to ensure that you're not masking your reduction by importing those very things. Secondly, you need it because your own industry wants to make sure that they are not being disadvantaged in the world market as well. So you have to look at those things. As far as electric cars are concerned, there are now many studies to show that environmentally they are enormously more worthwhile than their petrol or diesel equivalents. So I don't think there's an argument there. The argument is very much how China comes fully into the system. Now, there is good news in that, in the sense that they are committed to a net zero by 2060. Nobody believed that they'd come as soon up to that. The second thing is that it is genuinely true that they are doing a very great deal. And of course, they do have to do an enormous amount, because it is perfectly true that we've exported to them an awful lot of emissions, which had we not done it, we would be emitting ourselves long in the past. But that is very true. So they have a difficult problem, but they have to move faster. And their biggest role is that although they are now perhaps the world's biggest users of renewable energy, they are still expanding their use of coal, which is, of course, an unacceptable step now. The one thing we do have to do is to phase out coal. But then they're not alone in that. I mean, in my view, the country which is most at fault and has least excuse is Australia. Australia knows perfectly well what's happening. Australia has now had to invent a new colour for its temperature charts, because they're now going up so high that there was no colour for that chart. And Australia really has got to move, and it is not fair for Australia to do what it is doing at the moment, which is sort of agreeing but not really doing anything, while it benefits from these matters. So I think it's a really big issue. and all of us have got to seek to bring pressure on others. But if we don't do it ourselves, we can't get other people to do it as well.
I've just put up a second poll, but while we're doing that, we've got time for just a couple of more questions. John, I'd like to be curious. Paul Foley says that there's some major obstacles in the perverse incentives of government subsidy to carbon-intensive businesses. Could you identify one or two of these distorting drivers that you would like to have abolished?
Well, there's a lot of support of fossil fuels, which is absolutely unnecessary and should not be and should be reversed. I think the biggest government change, which would really make a difference, is the perverse incentives of government procurement, where it is still true that the cheapest cost is the thing that they go for. And until the government makes choices of the sort that it's asking the whole of the rest of the world to make on everything that it does, that will be a perverse incentive, which I really do believe will continue to damage us. And my last comment is, my goodness, I do think the government could change a whole lot of little rules, which would make so much difference. And one or two big ones. What about reversing the VAT? So if you did home improvements, particularly for energy efficiency, or if you improved rather than destroyed, you didn't pay VAT. And if you build fresh, you do pay VAT. It seems to me an odd concept that you waste so much because it's so much more expensive to alter, extend than it is to build entirely.
John, sadly, we're coming to the end of time. It's clear that people feel your target's achievable. Might have some arguments about the price, but I think you've won people over on that. We had a lot of other comments and questions. Rory Langford on, does a green economy need to be deflationary rather than inflationary? Matthew Leach on skills and education, and also Tesla's electric HGV. Andrew Ross is interested in the municipal bond market, net zero municipal bonds. So there's a lot happening here, but we just don't have time, sadly, to tackle it all. And actually, I should probably point out as well, Christopher Gleadle, very interested in the environmental return on investment being it required alongside financial returns. But I'd just like to close on one question. We have the target, we have the Climate Change Committee, and there's talk about this being legally enforceable. There's been a light around the world the last couple of years that we have a Climate Change Committee and that these targets are legally enforceable. What does that actually mean? Do we get to 2050 and we've achieved it? Fine, but if we haven't achieved it, what happens?
Well, no, the legal enforceability happens way before that. The budgets, of course, which lead up to it, and the sixth carbon budget we referred to, but there are 5 others, and they have been passed by Parliament. The rule is that when Parliament passes these budgets, it's democratically elected, Parliament passes the budgets then cannot be changed, except by the Climate Change Committee agreeing to change, and we've agreed to no such change. Now, what would happen would be this, simply, if it became clear in the annual reports of the Climate Change Committee, which we have to do, that the government is not meeting the requirements which will end up by the 5th carbon budget, for example, being met, or the 4th carbon budget, then they could be taken to court by somebody, let's say, like the organisation of lawyers, Client Earth, and then I would become the first witness for the prosecution. So what I found up to now is that the ministers are themselves rather disinclined to find themselves in court in those circumstances, and therefore they tend, when it looks as if they're not going to meet their targets, to get a hurry on. So the legal situation is not only seriously there, but it's there all the way along the line, which is the reason why I said to you, I do think interim targets are important. Otherwise, as you say, you'd reach 2049 and we wouldn't be there. And it wouldn't be much point in taking the government to court at that stage, but it would be much earlier on, because they would have, in fact, to have the target then enforced by the courts, which is the last thing they'd want.
Well, John, I've let this go on 5 minutes longer than I'm supposed to, simply because I'll read David Cope's comment. Brilliant event. How do we bottle John's enthusiasm and knowledge and sprinkle it across business and investors? So well done. If I may, I've got 3 quick rounds of thanks. One, as ever, to our sponsors for allowing us to range widely and freely on what is clearly one of the, if not the most important issue of our age. I know that many of you are involved in this, and I hope that you felt that today was worthwhile. I'd like to thank the audience. You've been very vibrant, and I will be passing all of those comments on to John for him to deal with. Just a reminder, we have one event tomorrow, just before Easter break. Strangely, it's about gold on April Fool's Day, so should I be talking about fool's gold? I don't know. But everything is very much on the website, and you can check all of that out. But finally, John, my thanks to you. As you know, I've long admired your work, and I too share David's respect for your enthusiasm and your knowledge, and really your selflessness. You've been tirelessly working at this as a concerned conservative and Catholic for many years, and we all want to encourage you to keep on going. And to do so, I'm afraid I am unable to open the floodgates of applause, although the comments will be sent to you, but I have brought my Korean karmic clapper, a sustainable audience here. And I say thank you very much. And we hope to have you back.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Goodbye.